In the second decade of the 20th century, the peaceful pastoral fields of northern France were transformed, changed into killing fields where death reigned on a staggering scale unimagined by generations past. It was the First World War, the Great War, its participants called it, because its scope was global. It engulfed the world, with fighting from France and Flanders and Poland and Prussia to Turkey, Africa, and far-flung regions of the earth. It lasted for more than 4 years, involved more than 70 million combatants, caused the fall and rise of nations, and killed more than 16 million people. It began in the summer of 1914, when Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife were making a goodwill visit to the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia. The Archduke was heir to the throne of the huge Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and minutes after this photograph was taken, he and his wife were assassinated by a Serbian terrorist. Their assassination ignited a chain reaction, putting armies on the march throughout Europe. The Austrian-Hungarian government declared war on Serbia. Because of a mutual defense treaty, France and Russia were dragged into the war on Serbia's side. Germany had an alliance with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and so went to war with France and Russia, which prompted Great Britain, an ally of France and Russia, to go to war with Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Soon, most of Europe and much of the world took sides, and the Great War became the deadliest war humanity had ever experienced. By 1917, after 3 years of horrendous slaughter, the war was locked in a stalemate, bogged down in trench warfare on the Eastern Front, where the German and Austrian-Hungarian forces battled the Russian army, and on the Western Front, where German troops waged war against the British and the French. Never had there been a war like this one. The Industrial Revolution and modern technology had produced new and savage weapons of death. The machine gun, the tank, mechanized troop carriers, submarine warfare, aerial combat, and poison gas. On the Western Front, at the Battle of the Somme in France, more than 1 million men fell dead or wounded in a prolonged battle with gains and losses measured in yards. It was death and destruction on a mammoth scale. But not in America. There, Americans were at peace. Content, self-sufficient in a continent-wide nation safely sprawling between 2 oceans. The United States was officially neutral, and for the first 3 years of the war, Americans watched from afar as Europe was consumed in an unprecedented bloodbath. Then a series of dramatic events caused American public opinion to change. Already, many Americans viewed Germany as the aggressor because German forces had invaded and conquered neutral Belgium in order to invade France, and American newspapers had been filled with stories of German brutality toward Belgian civilians. American resentment increased in 1915 when a German submarine sank a British ocean liner, the Lusitania, killing more than 1,100 civilian passengers including more than 120 Americans. Americans also considered Germany's introduction of poison gas on the battlefield to be a savage violation of the rules of warfare. Then, in 1917, with the encouragement of German leaders, communist revolutionaries seized control of the Russian government, eventually executed the Tsar and his family, and signed an armistice with Germany, pulling out of the war. That allowed enormous numbers of German troops to be shifted from the Eastern Front to battle the British and the French on the Western Front. There, British forces were exhausted, and French troops were discouraged almost to the point of mutiny. Germany appeared nearly triumphant in the Great War, and Americans began to fear what the world would be like if Imperial Germany ruled Europe. Also in 1917, flushed with the prospect of victory, Germany unleashed unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships traveling in English and French waters, including unarmed civilian ships. In response, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Germany, and on the same day, a German submarine sank an American cargo ship, the Housatonic. Everyone aboard survived, but the incident increased American anger toward Germany. Weeks later, Americans were even more enraged to learn of a coded secret German message called the Zimmermann Note, in which a German diplomat, Arthur Zimmermann, attempted to bribe the Mexican government into aiding Germany by declaring war on the United States. Public sentiment shifted, and Americans were finally ready to go to war with Germany. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson officially asked the United States Congress for a declaration of war, and by an overwhelming majority, Congress agreed. America was in the war.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there, over there, over there. Send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there.
In June of 1917, the first of 2 million American troops arrived in France, the first soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John Blackjack Pershing. To get the number of troops believed necessary to turn back the German juggernaut, the U.S. government established a military draft, which reached deep into the furthest reaches of America, to pluck young men from civilian life and place them in uniform. Few corners of America were more isolated in 1917 than the rural mountain country of north-central Tennessee and the tiny community of Pall Mall, which was cradled in the hills and hollows along the Wolf River near the Kentucky border. There, in a secluded valley that had changed little in a century, the military draft called up 29-year-old Alvin York, a blacksmith's son who grew up in a one-room log cabin shared by a large family.
He was one of 11 children, and basically they ate what they either grew or hunted. So it was very, very independent living and hard living. They worked from sunup to sundown. They barely went to school. They went to school just a few months out of the year.
The rugged hill country of north central Tennessee was a natural playground for young Alvin York, and like other country boys, he loved the outdoors.
Alvin and his brothers would go fishing. They'd go swimming in the river. They'd go skipping rocks on the river. They'd climb trees. They hunted, but they also did target shooting from a very young age.
In the Tennessee mountain culture, wild game was an important part of the family diet. Hunting was a way of life. Firearms were familiar tools, and good shots were plentiful. But even in a community of crack shots, young Alvin York became known as an expert marksman with a rifle.
He used to climb up in the trees and watch his dad shoot in the turkey shoots. And when he got his own gun, he would practice shooting. And they said he could shoot squirrels with one shot, and he was always a really good shot.
As a young man, York also earned a reputation as a local hellraiser. His blacksmith father had been killed by a kick from a mule, leaving Alvin to head the family at a young age. And the heavy responsibility apparently embittered him.
And he would go out drinking with his buddies, and then they would shoot trees up on their way home, shoot their initials in the trees, and just be loud and rambunctious. And he was a fighter. He got into a lot of fist fights and got into a lot of struggles.
Eventually, however, York attended a series of revival meetings at his local church, and his life underwent a dramatic transformation.
He was overwhelmed with God's love and God's grace, and he always had kind of this gnawing that I'm not the man I need to be. And that's when he finally just gave into it and said, God's in control, and I want to give my life to Christ.
Alvin York became a changed man, putting aside his rowdy ways to become an elder in his church and a song leader. But when the national draft called him into the Army in 1917, his personal faith placed him in a dilemma. He reported for duty as directed, but he also applied for conscientious objector status, stating that he did not want to fight anyone. His request was rejected, but he filed an appeal and continued to struggle internally over the dilemma between his faith and his duty, even as he demonstrated outstanding ability as a soldier. Ability that was obvious to his commanding officers. Led by his battalion commander, Major Edward Buxton, who was also devout, York's superiors counseled him and shared their belief that America was engaged in a just war.
They basically told him, you're really hardworking, and we can tell this is a really deep-rooted conflict that you have. You're not a slacker. You're not trying to get out of this war. This is a struggle you have at the core. And so they actually gave him some books and prayed with him and read some scriptures with him.
Given a 10-day leave to sort out his moral crisis, York came here, back to the isolated Wolf River country of Tennessee. He climbed up to a favorite prayer spot, a rocky ridge called the Yellow Doors.
And he got his Bible and his dog and went to the Yellow Doors and prayed for 3 days about going to war.
When he came down from the mountain, Alvin York had reached a resolution. Sometimes, he concluded, being a peacemaker meant fighting for peace, and that's what he intended to do. "300 miles southeast of Alvin York's isolated hollows and ridges, in the rural South Carolina upcountry near the town of Anderson, another country boy was also facing the military draft. His life had much in common with Alvin York's, but also much that was different. His name was Freddie Stowers, and like Alvin York, he grew up in the rural South in a large farming family of limited means and little formal education, one of 10 children. and with some different challenges. Freddie Stowers was a 21-year-old African American living in an era of segregation in a sharecropping family.
You could say they would have been typical, especially for an African American family. It's likely that they didn't own the land they were working. There's still a good deal of sharecropping kind of going on.
Like these children of his generation, Freddie Stowers was the descendant of slaves, and like many farm children in the South, he apparently never had his photograph taken.
They're not going to have a camera laying around, so it's very common to have families that don't have photographs.
Today, Freddie Stowers' image is preserved in a conjectural rendering based on research and family descriptions. Black or white, sharecropping families in early 20th century America were accustomed to hard work and lots of it.
It was hard work from sunup to sundown, and usually either 6 days a week or 5.5 days a week, because some landowner would give farmers Saturday afternoon off to take care of their personal needs and maintain their personal gardens. Most of the sharecroppers, in addition to being sharecroppers, had a small garden. And some of them also had some chickens and some pigs.
Southern farming families in the early 20th century were typically close-knit and family-focused as well as hard-working, with little time to be idle. And the hard work of farm life was viewed as character building, good for a child.
I think one of our shortcomings today is that we put a lot of emphasis on teaching children how to play, but we're not teaching children how to work.
One acceptable break from work for Southern farm families was church. And just as it was in Alvin York's Tennessee mountain community, the local church was the center of spiritual and social life in South Carolina's rural African American community.
Say every fifth Sunday, all of the churches in a certain area would come together and they would engage the best preachers and the best Sunday school teachers. And everybody could find out what good preaching and good teaching was all about. On Children's Day, the church would always serve white bread, loaf of breads, and lemonades. And of course, that was quite a treat.
The woods and fields and creeks around the family farm were a natural playground for Stowers, and like Alvin York and other country boys, he acquired knowledge and skills unique to outdoor life.
Because occasionally you would have to hunt rabbits and squirrels because they supplement produce from the farm. And so occasionally one would have to go out and look for rabbits or trap raccoons, look for squirrels, and I suppose that provided a certain amount of enjoyment.
Although Stowers' educational options were limited as a boy, his parents made sure that he could read and write and get all the schooling he could.
You also find that in those early years, the parents played a major role in helping to teach the children. My father, for example, required us to stand by his chair and read our schoolwork to him every night.
Molded by farm life, the church, education, and parental instruction, Freddie Stowers, as a man, demonstrated responsibility and discipline.
Mothers, on the one hand, can teach us all the value of love. And of course, love is absolutely critical. Learning how to love is absolutely critical. But fathers play a bigger role, I think, in teaching discipline, duty. And you need both of those in life. You need the capacity to love, but you also need an understanding of duty and discipline.
As a young man, Stowers became a sharecropper like his parents before him in the rural South Carolina upcountry. Like this couple, he got married to his sweetheart, a young woman named Pearl. The two parented a daughter named Minnie Lee and set out together to make the best of life. Then, like Alvin York in Tennessee, Freddie Stowers was snatched away from family, home, and the only life he knew by the Great War in Europe. Like Alvin York, he was drafted into the U.S. Army, eventually serving in the all-black 371st Infantry Regiment, which belonged to the Army's 93rd Infantry Division, one of two new divisions of African American troops. The U.S. military was still racially segregated, although black troops served with white officers. Already, African American soldiers had earned a reputation as good troops, first in the Northern military in the Civil War, and later in the Indian Wars of the West, where the black troops of the U.S. 9th and 10th Cavalry and the U.S. 24th and 25th Infantry achieved fame as Buffalo soldiers for their courage in combat. Stowers did well in basic training, and like Alvin York, he was influenced and inspired by one of his commanders, a white officer who believed in treating all soldiers equally regardless of race.
He was trained by a man who had differing views from the way most military officers viewed African American troops. He didn't see them as lesser. He was quoted as saying that he's never had any trouble with African American troops not performing as a white troop would.
Bolstered by his upbringing, character, and competence, Freddie Stowers soon proved himself to be a natural leader, earning the rank of Private First Class in less than 2 months and receiving a promotion to corporal and squad leader 6 months later.
The notion of duty was very important in the black community. Duty to parents, duty to church, and of course, it eventually extended to duty to country.
By the time Stowers made corporal in May of 1918, his regiment was in France and heading for action, part of more than 200,000 African American soldiers deployed to Europe. At the time Corporal Stowers was deployed in France with his regiment, Alvin York was there too, serving in the 328th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 82nd Infantry Division.
Life was pretty tough for him because he was singled out as being a conscientious objector. So in the beginning, he was really put under scrutiny, but then he actually rose in the ranks pretty quickly and was given more responsibility, even in basic training, because he was such a hardworking, good soldier. And he was a man of character.
Like Freddie Stowers, Alvin York's character and farm family skills and values served him well in the military, and he too quickly rose to corporal and squad leader. In the spring of 1918, York and the other soldiers in his regiment experienced their baptism of fire and were exposed to the savagery of World War I combat. In his pocket diary, he wrote, "The Germans was shelling the road and aeroplanes was humming over our heads and we were stumbling over dead horses and dead men and shells were bursting all around me." Both Alvin York and Freddie Stowers were part of gigantic offensive operations in which Allied forces on the Western Front, bolstered now by a huge infusion of American troops, stopped the German advance just 50 miles outside Paris, then began driving back German forces across France toward the border of Germany. Despite their inexperience in battle, the fresh American troops made the difference for the Allies. At Chateau-Thierry, Belleau Wood, the Second Battle of the Marne, and Saint-Mihiel, American forces repeatedly defeated and drove back German troops. Then, in September of 1918, the Allied armies launched a mighty follow-up campaign designed to destroy the German army or drive it back into Germany and end the war. It was called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, named for two key French landmarks at its center, the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. The massive attack was spearheaded by more than 1 million American soldiers. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive broke the back of the German army and opened the door to an Allied invasion of the German fatherland. It was too much. Germany's leaders finally gave up and asked for an armistice, which was granted. And the Great War, World War I, ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11, 1918. But the Allied victory and the final offensive that produced it came at great cost. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was a slaughterhouse. In 6.5 weeks, more than 300,000 troops on both sides were killed or wounded, and among those who were rushed into the inferno were Corporals Freddie Stowers and Alvin York. Today, long after the guns of the Great War fell silent, the Meuse-Argonne region of France is again a pastoral place of serene beauty. Rolling fields of pastel-colored wheat washed by the wind are painted lavender by a sea of wildflowers. The same picturesque villages that mark the maps of World War I still perch on hazy ridges. The shadowed glades of the Argonne forest shelter the lost cries of angry and anguished men. And amid the peaceful scenery of northern France today stands numerous monuments and reminders of that long-ago war. Historic battlefields, once stained by the lifeblood of young men, are known now for their aging artillery and scarlet poppies. Trench lines that once held soldiers waiting shoulder to shoulder to rush courageously over the top are now reduced to shallow depressions filled only with dirt and grass. Scattered about in villages and countryside alike are monuments large and small, commemorating what was once thought to be the war to end all wars. Some tower over well-groomed lawns and foliage as modern landmarks, or sprawl impressively with walls and columns of marble grandeur. Others, small and personal, reflect the art of forgotten sculptors determined to memorialize the heart-rending soldier sacrifices that many survivors ache to forget. Like the former fields of fire and fury, most of the monuments today are lonely sites, seldom visited amid the many distractions of modern life and the competing monuments of a later war. But once, the fields, the forests, the roads, the villages are at the center of a life and death struggle that forever changed the world. In late September of 1918, as the Allies' Meuse-Argonne offensive lumbered forward in a mighty attempt to conquer the enemy and end the bloodbath once and for all, Corporal Freddie Stowers and the 371st Infantry Regiment came here, to the French village of Sacol, which then lay on the western flank of the Allied advance. It was the front line, and facing it was the war-weary French army. Stowers and his regiment and other black troops of the 93rd Division had been placed under French command, alongside units of the French 157th Infantry Division, which was desperate for fresh troops. The French army included many French colonial troops, and the black soldiers of the 93rd Division were no longer segregated. They retained their U.S. Army uniforms but were issued French arms and equipment, including the distinctive French helmet. Today, at the edge of the village of Sacol, stands a monument to the Harlem Hellfighters, the 93rd Infantry's most famous regiment of African American troops. And within sight of the monument, in the distance, towering above the tranquil farmland, rises a high hill, In September of 1918, it was known to French troops as Hill 188. Stretching across it was the infamous Hindenburg Line, the main German defensive line on the Western Front. Atop Hill 188 was a German signal station, and that was the target of the French 157th Infantry Division, including Corporal Stowers' regiment. It was protected by two lines of trenches, which were fortified by sandbags, barbed wire entanglements, deadly machine guns, anti-tank guns, and trench mortars that could kill a dozen men in a single blast.
The German front had set up trenches. They were encamped behind machine guns, had set up barbed wire barricades, and were pretty well entrenched. And the American forces were slowly but surely making advances.
Capturing Hill 188 and its vitally important signal station was a deadly assignment. Other troops had already tried and failed. From atop the hill, its German defenders had a clear field of fire on the Allied approach. It was a killing field waiting to happen, and spearheading the assault by the French army were the American troops, led by Company C of the 371st Infantry Regiment, squad leader Freddie Stowers' company. The night before the attack, under the cover of darkness, Corporal Stowers and the other troops of the 371st moved into position to make a dawn attack. Just getting to the base of the hill was difficult.
It had been raining, and the terrain was torn to pieces by previous mortar blasts and different things, digging trenches and filling trenches in, and it was loose, it was wet, so it was really tough going for trying to move around.
During the night, the commander of a French regiment posted nearby informed Stowers' battalion commander that the Germans had abandoned their defenses. Maybe, some soldiers speculated, the attack would be a cakewalk. But that was not to be. At H hour, 6:45 a.m. on September 28, 1918, Corporal Stowers and the 371st Infantry Regiment advanced through a heavy ground fog and began their assault on Hill 188. The Germans had not withdrawn. The hill was heavily defended, and from its military crest, the German defenders poured searing fire into the advancing American and French troops, raking them mercilessly with sustained fire from machine guns, rifles, anti-tank guns, and trench mortars. On the left flank of the assault, French colonial troops broke and ran, leaving the American flank exposed to enfilading fire from the front and the side. Casualties were mounting, but on they advanced, pushing up the hill despite devastating fire. The fierce fire forced them to the ground, but they advanced anyway, cutting through the barbed wire entanglements and crawling forward on their bellies as they poured fire into the German lines. Allied artillery, which had been shelling the German line everywhere the Allies were attacking, had to hold its fire on the section of the line the 371st was assaulting, because Stowers and his fellow soldiers had pushed forward so close to the German line that the artillery crews were afraid they would hit their own troops. Up the hill under fire, Stowers and the men of the 371st slowly and steadily crawled forward, inching their way toward the German lines and unleashing deadly rifle fire on the German defenders. Suddenly, the Germans signaled their surrender. Stowers and the men of his regiment stood up and moved forward to take prisoners, but it was a deadly trick.
Where the Germans showed, they signaled physically and verbally surrender. The Stowers Company, Company C, comes out to start taking prisoners, and at that time they jumped back in the trenches, got behind machine guns, and started mowing them down.
All around him, Stowers' fellow soldiers fell dead or wounded. More than half the company was down, including every officer Stowers could see. Without hesitation, he rallied the surviving troops and ordered them to follow him up the ridge and into the German forward trench toward a machine gun nest that had already shot down scores of American troops. He had to know that taking the lead, being the point man, meant taking a deadly risk, but he did so anyway.
So I think it was probably more personal drive than anything else to really prove himself. And he may not have even known that he had that in him until it was, it was called on.
They plunged into the trench, engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat with the German defenders, overcame all of them, and knocked out the machine gun nest. But that was only half the objective. Ahead lay another trench line protecting the German signal station, and it too was teeming with enemy troops and defended by machine guns. Even so, Corporal Stowers called on the surviving soldiers of Company C to resume the assault, and again he took the lead. The enemy fire was ferocious, but inspired by Stowers' leadership, the men courageously followed him. As he neared the second German trench, Stowers was hit by a burst of machine gun fire and went down. Even though he was grievously wounded, he waved his men forward and commanded them to take the enemy trench, and they did.
He rallied the rest of the troops and led a charge on the trenches, which they did take.
Stowers' wounds were mortal, and he died on that remote ridge in northern France. But even as his lifeblood ebbed away, he used his last breath to urge his troops onward, and they obeyed. Reinforced by reserve troops, they overran the signal station, defeated the remaining German defenders, and drove them off the hill in a victory inspired by Corporal Stowers even as he died.
It was definitely a great display of leadership. He picked up when hope seemed lost in the battle and finished it out till his end.
Elsewhere, other American and Allied assaults followed the example set by the men of the 371st Infantry, and the mighty German Hindenburg Line wavered and crumbled. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was rolling forward in a surge of victory, and in no place was it more victorious than atop Hill 188, due in no small measure to the courageous and sacrificial leadership of Corporal Freddie Stowers. "12 miles to the east of Hill 188 and 10 days later, Corporal Alvin York and the soldiers of his unit found themselves facing another heavily defended German hilltop position as Allied forces launched a final attack. The sector of the German line targeted for York's regiment was located just outside the French village of Châtel-Cheheray, which today is still a quiet, remote hamlet located on the edge of the Argonne forest. The village's peaceful solitude was disrupted in 1918 by occupation German troops who had fortified the forested hills outside of town to protect a rural railroad in the rear that served as a vital German supply line. American forces were tasked with taking that railroad, and to help do it, York and his regiment were ordered to make a daybreak assault against the German forward lines near Châtel-Cheheray on the foggy, wet morning of October 8, 1918. They drove back the Germans and took the hill, Hill 223, but it was another German trick, a fake retreat to draw the Americans into a bowl-shaped valley, which was a pre-selected killing field. It was an ambush. The Americans began taking machine gun fire from the surrounding ridges, suffering heavy casualties. In Alvin York's words, "The Germans got us right smart. They just stopped us right in our tracks." The American commanding officer ordered a sergeant to take 16 men, including York, and to slip around ridges and try to knock out the German machine guns. Moving through the woods was easy for York. The ridges, hills, and hollows resembled the country back home in Tennessee.
I think instinct kicked in. I do. If you look at Châtel-Chehery, France, in the Argonne Forest where the battle occurred, and you look at pictures of Pall Mall, the terrain is so similar. I just feel like he felt at home, and I feel like instinct kicked in.
They slipped through the woods, crossed a little brook, and walked up on a large number of German soldiers led by an English-speaking German officer. They captured all of them. But as they lined up their German prisoners, they were spotted by German machine gunners on a nearby ridge, who yelled for the German prisoners to get down and then opened fire on the Americans. 9 were killed or wounded, including the sergeant, which left Corporal York in command of the 7 other survivors. Taking charge, he ordered his fellow soldiers to stay down, then found a good marksman's position on the ridge and began trading fire with the German riflemen and machine gunners.
He told his buddies, stay put. The machine guns were just laying fire all around him. People were dying, and I really believe that at that moment he got mad, but it was this righteous anger that I've got to stop them before more killing happens.
One after another, York picked off 19 German soldiers. All I could do, he later related, was to touch off the Germans just as fast as I could. When he had suppressed the enemy fire, he hurried back to his men and took cover amid the German prisoners. At that moment, a German platoon leader spotted him and led 5 German soldiers in a bayonet charge toward York's position. York's rifle was empty, so he took aim with his .45 caliber sidearm while yelling for the charging soldiers to surrender.
All the while he kept saying, just surrender, because he didn't want to take lives, but he realized he had to do something to save lives.
The enemy soldiers kept coming, so York used his short-range .45 to shoot them down one at a time using a turkey hunting technique he had perfected back home.
That was one of his hunting strategies. If there's turkeys coming at you, if there's geese coming at you, you don't shoot the first one because the rest of the flock will scatter. You actually start from the back. And that was actually his mentality when the Germans came by foot, coming charging down the hillside at him. That's how he took them out from the back to the front, so that they didn't realize that all their fellow soldiers were gone.
Finally, York stopped the platoon leader in front. When that happened, the English-speaking German officer he had captured earlier urged York to stop shooting his men, blew a whistle, and dozens more Germans on the ridge came down and surrendered. York and his 6 surviving fellow soldiers marched more than 100 captured German soldiers out of the woods and down the road toward Châtel-Chehery in the American rear. Today, the forested ridges near Châtel-Chehery bear few signs of warfare. But in these now quiet woods, the legend and legacy of Alvin York was born. Here, it was determined by U.S. Army investigators, Corporal Alvin York almost single-handedly put 35 machine guns out of commission, killed 28 enemy soldiers in combat, captured 132 German prisoners of war, and in so doing, saved countless American lives. It was also determined that York's heroic action stopped an intended enemy counterattack and led to a collapse of German defenses in that sector. When his commanding officer exclaimed, "York, I hear you captured the whole German army," York modestly replied, "No, sir, I just got 132. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was a climactic victory on the Western Front, delivering a death blow to German forces. And 1 month later, after Austrian-Hungarian forces gave up, Germany agreed to the armistice that ended World War I in an Allied victory. With the war over, Americans in uniform returned home, Alvin York among them, now promoted to Sergeant York. His actions near Châtel-Chehery that drizzly morning in October earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the French Croix de Guerre and Legion of Honor, and the Medal of Honor. His heroic conduct was largely unknown in America, however, until shortly before he returned home, when the popular American magazine Saturday Evening Post published his dramatic story. When his ship arrived in New York City, he was greeted by cheering crowds and recognized in Washington by a joint session of Congress. But Alvin York was uncomfortable in the limelight. He believed he was no more deserving of honor than the other soldiers with him that day, and just wanted to go home to the backcountry of Tennessee.
Upon returning to America, he actually looked at the Statue of Liberty and said, "Lady, if you're ever going to see me face to face, you're going to have to turn around, because I'm not ever going across this ocean again."
Back home, he fulfilled his two stated goals. He embraced his elderly mother, and within 1 week he married his childhood sweetheart, Gracie Williams. They would parent 8 children, and their home still stands today near the banks of the Wolf River as the centerpiece of the Sergeant Alvin York State Park and Historic Site. The land and house were donated to York after the war by a well-meaning Tennessee Civic Club, but the donation actually came with a huge mortgage that York and his wife struggled to pay for decades. Even so, York declined offers that would have earned him a fortune, explaining that he could not sell his uniform or capitalize on killing, especially when the real heroes, he believed, were the 116,000 American soldiers who never returned home. Instead, he established a gristmill and a general store, but he was more generous than businesslike.
I always say he had a big heart, but he was not a good businessman, because he would give stuff away. People would come in and need food. He would never turn a customer away. And if they couldn't pay their bill at the end of the month, he would never hassle them.
He did put his fame to work to help his community, lobbying for improved roads and education in the Tennessee backcountry, helping his local church, establishing an interdenominational Bible school, and doing much to improve life for those in his state who had little.
He is truly an example how one person can make a difference, how one person standing up for what they believe and fighting for what they believe in has a positive ripple effect across a whole community, a whole state, a whole country.
In 1941, on the eve of World War II, Alvin York reluctantly agreed to let Hollywood tell his story. He had declined other film offers, but he needed funds to start a school, and he was influenced by national leaders who believed his story could be important and inspirational as another war in Europe loomed. The film was called Sergeant York and starred actor Gary Cooper. It won 2 Academy Awards and was the most popular motion picture in America in 1941. Cooper won an Oscar for his portrayal of York, but had to apologize when York discovered him smoking a cigarette on the movie set and admonished him for setting a bad example for children. When America entered World War II, Alvin York volunteered for military duty, but he was turned down because of his age. Instead, he helped promote the sale of war bonds and continued to pursue his many projects to help others. In 1964, at age 76, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage in a Tennessee Veterans Hospital and was mourned throughout the nation as a genuine American hero.
We have people that come from all over the world to see Sergeant York's home site. It's usually because of the movie. It's usually they became a Christian or they went into the military because of the movie. It's just something that still rings true to this day, because we don't have heroes like Alvin around very much in our day.
Corporal Freddie Stowers, one of the Americans that Alvin York considered to be the real heroes of the war, never came home. He was buried in French soil alongside other soldiers from his regiment at the base of Hill 188, the critically important hill they had fought and died to capture. Later, their remains were reinterred 20 miles away in a newly established military cemetery for U.S. troops, the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. There, Corporal Freddie Stowers was buried under a white marble headstone with more than 14,000 of his fellow soldiers, most of whom died in the Meuse-Argonne fighting. Back home in South Carolina, Pearl Stowers received the official notice from the U.S. Army. At age 22, her husband Freddie had been killed in action in France.
I think it's always hard to hear that a loved one has passed away, perhaps even more so when you haven't heard from them for months or perhaps a year, and not knowing where they were, or how they were doing for all that time, and then to suddenly get the knock on the door.
There, Freddie Stowers' story may have ended. A white headstone in a foreign land, far from home, one of more than 116,000 Americans who laid down their lives for their country in World War I. But the story of Freddie Stowers' sacrificial act of bravery resurfaced more than 70 years later. After the assault on Hill 188, the 93rd Infantry Division's commander, a white officer, recommended several of his black soldiers for the nation's second highest military honor, the Distinguished Service Cross. But upon learning of Corporal Stowers' heroic combat conduct, which inspired his company to capture Hill 188 even after he fell mortally wounded, the officer recommended Stowers for the highest award available to Americans, the Medal of Honor. The Distinguished Service Crosses he recommended were awarded, but Corporal Stowers' Medal of Honor was not, for more than 70 years. Then, in the late 1980s, a bipartisan effort in Congress requested that the Department of Defense research potentially overlooked Medal of Honor recipients from World War I, especially minority soldiers. Army researchers eventually reported that Corporal Stowers' recommendation for the Medal of Honor had never received action and had somehow been lost in the system.
Some have argued in the past that it was because he fought under a French flag instead of an American flag, and there was some delay there in recognizing service, or of course there's the argument that being an African American soldier, he wasn't valued like a white soldier would have been valued.
In 1991, more than 72 years after his heroic action on Hill 188 in France, Corporal Freddie Stowers was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, which was presented to surviving family members in a White House ceremony by President George Herbert Walker Bush. Corporal Stowers' conspicuous gallantry, extraordinary heroism, and supreme devotion to his men, his citation read, follow the finest tradition of military service. Today, at the Anderson County Museum in his home state of South Carolina, Corporal Freddie Stowers' life and heroism are memorialized. And at nearby Anderson University, a life-size statue of Stowers commemorates his sacrifice for his country. In faraway France, a memorial to Stowers and the other soldiers of the 371st Infantry Regiment stands as a silent sentinel on isolated Hill 188 above the sprawling fields of the Meuse-Argonne. And in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, amid the crosses row on row, a modern headstone marks the resting place of Medal of Honor winner Freddie Stowers. Alvin York and Freddie Stowers, both American farm boys, both family men, both patriots, both men of honor.